The night was cold, and the wind howled through the empty streets. Emily pulled her thin coat tighter around herself and held her son close. The little boy, no older than 6, shivered in her arms. His small hands clutched at her coat, seeking warmth that she didn't have to give. Her heart ached as she looked down at him. He was tired, hungry, and scared. She had to find shelter, no matter what. Her tired eyes lifted to the enormous mansion in front of her. The lights inside glowed warmly, a sharp contrast to the freezing night outside. It was the kind of house she had only seen in movies, tall, grand, and surrounded by perfectly trimmed gardens. For a moment, she hesitated. What if they turned her away? What if they called the police? But then she looked at her son again, his tiny face pale with exhaustion. She had no choice. With trembling fingers, she walked up the stone steps and knocked on the large wooden door. The sound echoed through the quiet night. She waited, her heart pounding in her chest. Seconds felt like hours. She knocked again, harder this time. The door finally opened, and a man in a black suit stood before her. His sharp eyes scanned her from head to toe, clearly judging her appearance. Emily swallowed hard. She knew how she looked. Her hair was messy, her clothes worn out, and her face marked with the struggles of the past few years. "Please," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I just need a place to stay for the night. My son, he's cold." The butler frowned, glancing at the sleeping boy in her arms. He looked back at Emily, uncertain. "This is a private residence, madam. I'm afraid." "Who is it, Richard?" A deep voice came from inside. The butler turned, stepping aside slightly. Emily froze. The voice sounded familiar, but it couldn't be, could it? A tall man stepped forward. His presence filled the doorway. He was dressed in a crisp black suit, his dark hair neatly styled. His face was older than she remembered, more refined, but his eyes, those deep brown eyes, were the same. Emily's breath caught in her throat. He stared at her for a long moment, confusion flashing across his face. Then his expression changed, his eyes widening in shock. "Emily," he whispered. Her heart skipped a beat. He knew her, even after all these years, after all the pain and distance between them. He still recognized her. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Tears burned in her eyes, not just from the cold, but from the flood of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. James Carter, her first love. The man she had never stopped thinking about. The man who had once promised her forever, before life tore them apart. And now, here she was, standing at his door in the dead of night, homeless, desperate, and completely unprepared for what was about to happen next. Would he help her? Or would he turn her away like everyone else had? James couldn't believe his eyes. The woman standing before him, shivering in the cold, was Emily. His Emily. The girl he had once loved more than anything in the world. The girl he had dreamed of marrying. The girl he had lost. For a moment, he thought he was imagining things. Maybe it was just someone who looked like her. But no, those eyes, that face, even beneath the tiredness and pain, it was her. He took a step forward, his heart pounding. "Emily," he said again, his voice barely more than a whisper. Emily felt her breath catch. She had prayed for help tonight, but never in her wildest dreams had she thought she would end up here, facing the one person she had tried to forget. Her hands trembled as she held her son close, unsure of what to say. James looked at the child in her arms. A boy, around 6 years old, fast asleep, his small face buried in Emily's shoulder. His clothes were thin, not nearly warm enough for the freezing night. James felt something twist inside him. Pity, concern, and something else he couldn't quite name. Emily opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She had imagined seeing James again so many times, but not like this. Not when she was at her lowest, with nothing to her name. Shame washed over her, but she pushed it down. Her son's safety was more important than her pride. I didn't know it was your house," she finally said, her voice barely audible. I was just looking for a place to stay, just for one night. James took a deep breath, trying to process everything. The woman he had once planned a future with was now standing at his door, homeless and desperate. His mind raced with questions. How had she ended up like this? Where had she been all these years? Why had she never reached out? The butler, Richard, cleared his throat. "Sir, should I call someone to?" "No," James interrupted quickly. He couldn't just turn her away. Not Emily. Not after everything they had been through. "Let them in." Richard hesitated but then stepped aside. Emily's eyes widened slightly. She hadn't expected James to say yes. Relief washed over her, but at the same time, doubt crept in. Was she making a mistake? Would he regret helping her? She stepped inside hesitantly, feeling the warmth of the mansion surround her. It was beautiful, just as grand as she had imagined a millionaire's home would be. A large chandelier hung from the ceiling, and the floor beneath her was polished marble. The warmth felt almost unreal after spending so many nights in the cold. James watched as she looked around, her eyes filled with uncertainty. He still couldn't believe she was here. The last time he had seen her, they had been young and in love, full of dreams. And now she was a homeless mother, standing in his mansion with nothing but the clothes on her back. He wanted to ask her so many things, but he held back. Now wasn't the time. "Come," he said gently. "You must be hungry." Emily's lips parted slightly, and for the first time that night, her eyes softened. She nodded, following him further inside. She didn't know what would happen next, but for now, she and her son had a place to rest. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to hope. Emily followed James through the grand hallway, feeling the warmth of the mansion seep into her frozen skin. Her son, still asleep in her arms, stirred slightly but did not wake up. She looked down at his small face, pressing a gentle kiss on his forehead. At least for tonight, he wouldn't have to sleep outside in the cold. James led her to a large dining room, where a long wooden table stood in the center. A beautiful chandelier hung above, casting a soft golden glow. Everything looked so luxurious, so different from the life she had been living. It almost felt like stepping into another world. James turned to Richard, the butler. "Bring some food," he said, his voice calm but firm. Richard hesitated for a moment before nodding and leaving the room. Emily shifted nervously, feeling out of place. She had never imagined she would step into a mansion like this, and she definitely hadn't imagined she would ever see James again. James pulled out a chair for her. "Sit," he said softly. Emily hesitated but finally sat down, carefully cradling her son in her lap. James sat across from her, his eyes filled with questions. For a few moments, there was silence between them. The past stood between them like an invisible wall, heavy and unspoken. Finally, James spoke. "Where have you been all these years?" Emily lowered her eyes, swallowing hard. She didn't know where to begin. How could she explain everything in just a few words? How could she tell him about the struggles, the heartbreak, and the endless nights of wondering what went wrong? I've been surviving," she said finally. "Life didn't go the way I thought it would." James watched her closely. He could see the pain in her eyes, the exhaustion in her face. She looked so different from the girl he once knew. Back then, she had been full of life, always laughing, always dreaming about the future. Now she looked like someone who had fought too many battles and lost too many times. Before he could ask more, Richard returned with a tray of food. A bowl of warm soup, fresh bread, and a glass of milk were placed in front of her. The smell of the food made Emily's stomach tighten. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. "Thank you," she whispered, picking up the spoon with shaky hands. She took a small sip of the soup, closing her eyes as the warmth spread through her body. It felt like heaven. James continued watching her, his mind filled with memories. He remembered the nights they used to sit under the stars, talking about their dreams. He remembered promising her a future together. And now she was here, struggling just to get through the night. As she ate, her son slowly woke up. His eyes fluttered open, and he looked around confused. "Mama," he murmured. Emily stroked his hair gently. "It's okay, sweetheart. We're safe." James felt something stir inside him. He didn't know this boy, but something about him made his heart ache. He wanted to know more, but he didn't want to push Emily too hard. For now, he just wanted to make sure she was okay. And deep down, he knew that this night was only the beginning. Emily wiped her son's mouth gently as he finished the last bite of bread. His small stomach was finally full, and his eyelids drooped as sleep threatened to take over again. She cradled him close, stroking his soft brown hair, her heart filling with both relief and sorrow. She was grateful for the warm food and shelter, but she hated feeling so helpless, sitting in front of James like this. James watched them in silence, his mind filled with questions. He had so much to say, so much he wanted to ask, but he didn't know where to begin. The woman sitting before him was both familiar and a stranger. The Emily he had known was full of dreams, laughter, and endless energy. But the Emily sitting here tonight looked tired, fragile, and weighed down by the burdens of life. He leaned forward slightly, his voice soft but firm. "Emily, what happened to you?" Emily stiffened. The question was simple, but the answer was not. She let out a slow breath, her fingers tightening around her son's small hand. "Life happened," she said quietly. James frowned. "That's not an answer." She looked up at him, her eyes dark with pain. "What do you want me to say, James? That everything fell apart? That I lost everything? That I had nowhere to go, no one to turn to?" Her voice trembled. "Because that's the truth." James felt something twist inside him. He had never imagined Emily in such a situation. Back when they were young, she had been the strongest person he knew. She never gave up, no matter what life threw at her. But now, she looked like someone who had been fighting for far too long without rest. He exhaled slowly. "Why didn't you ever reach out to me?" Emily let out a bitter laugh. "Reach out to you? James, you left. You went to college, and then you became this." She gestured at the mansion around them. "You had a whole new life, a whole new world. I was just a part of your past." James shook his head. "That's not true." Emily's eyes burned with emotion. "Then why didn't you ever come back?" she whispered. "Why didn't you ever look for me?" James opened his mouth but found no words. He had thought about her over the years, wondered where she was, if she was happy. But he had assumed she had moved on, that she had built a life for herself, just as he had been told she would. "I didn't know," he finally said, his voice quiet. "I didn't know things were this bad." Emily looked away, blinking back tears. "Well, now you do." Silence filled the room, heavy and thick. James stared at her, his heart aching. He had so many regrets, so many what-ifs. He had thought she had chosen a different path. He had never imagined that her journey had been so full of struggle. Emily shifted her son in her arms. "I don't want your pity, James," she said softly. "I just needed a place for my son tonight. That's all." James clenched his jaw. He wasn't sure what he was feeling, but one thing was certain. He couldn't just let her walk away again. Not this time. James sat back in his chair, his mind racing with thoughts. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Emily, the girl he had once loved more than anything, had suffered so much, and he had never known. He had spent years building his business, making a name for himself, thinking she had moved on with her life. But now, sitting in front of him, she looked nothing like the girl he had left behind. He took a deep breath, his voice softer now. "Emily, I swear, I never knew. If I had, I would have." She let out a small, tired laugh. "You would have what, James? Come looking for me. Save me." She shook her head. "Life doesn't work like that. We were young. We went our separate ways. That's just how it is." James clenched his fists. Something didn't feel right. It didn't make sense. Emily was never the type to give up easily. He had always admired her strength, her determination. Back then, they had promised to stay together no matter what. What had changed? "Did you ever try to find me?" he asked, watching her closely. Emily froze for a moment. Then she let out a shaky breath. "I did." Her voice was almost a whisper. "I wrote to you." James's heart stopped. "What?" "I wrote to you, James," she said again, looking up at him with sadness in her eyes. "After you left, I sent letters. I tried to reach you, but I never got a reply." James felt like the ground beneath him had disappeared. He had never received a single letter from her. Not one. His jaw tightened. "Are you sure?" "I never got anything." Emily gave a sad smile. "I sent them to your college address. I waited for weeks, months, but you never wrote back." James suddenly stood up, running a hand through his hair. His mind was spinning. Could it be possible that someone had kept those letters from him? Had someone made sure he never heard from Emily again? His mother's voice echoed in his mind. "Emily will only hold you back, James. She's not part of your future. You need to focus on your career." His blood ran cold. Had his mother? No, he didn't want to believe it. But deep down, something told him it was true. Emily watched him, her expression unreadable. "It doesn't matter anymore," she said softly. "That was a long time ago." James turned to her, his chest tightening. "It does matter," he said firmly. "I never stopped caring about you, Emily. And if someone kept those letters from me, if you thought I abandoned you—" He swallowed hard. "I need to know the truth." Emily looked down at her son, who was sleeping peacefully in her arms. "The truth won't change anything, James," she murmured. "I'm not that girl anymore. And you have your own life now." James's heart ached at her words. She was right. So much had changed. But one thing hadn't. He still cared. And he wasn't going to let her walk away this time. James couldn't sleep that night. He sat alone in his study, staring out at the dark sky through the large window. His mind was filled with memories of Emily, the girl he had once planned to spend his life with, the girl he had thought about for years. And now she was back, but in a way he never expected. The thought of her struggling, being homeless, broke something inside him. He had spent years building his fortune, buying everything he had ever wanted. But tonight, looking at Emily and her son, he felt like he had nothing at all. Had his mother really kept Emily's letters from him? The thought made his blood boil. He knew she had never approved of Emily. She had always said Emily wouldn't fit into the life she wanted for him. But would she really go as far as to keep them apart? James rubbed his temples. He needed to find out the truth. The next morning, he walked downstairs and found Emily sitting in the living room, her son curled up beside her on the couch. The boy was still asleep, his tiny chest rising and falling peacefully. Emily was awake, staring at the floor, lost in thought. James cleared his throat, and she looked up. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, James sat down across from her. "Emily, I need to ask you something." She sighed, already looking tired. "James, why didn't you try to reach me in person?" He interrupted gently. "If you thought I was ignoring your letters, why didn't you come find me?" Emily looked away, her fingers tightening on the fabric of her son's small blanket. "I did." James's heart pounded. "What?" She took a deep breath. "I went to your college once," she admitted. "I waited outside, hoping I would see you. But I never did." James leaned forward. "Did you talk to anyone?" Emily nodded slowly. "Your mother." A cold chill ran through James's veins. "She saw me waiting and came over," Emily continued, her voice quiet. "She told me you had moved on, that you had a bright future ahead of you, and that I wasn't part of it." She gave a small, bitter smile. "She said you didn't want me holding you back." James's hands clenched into fists. "That's not true." Emily let out a shaky breath. "I believed her, James. What else was I supposed to think?" You never wrote back, and then your own mother told me you didn't want me anymore." Her voice broke slightly. "So, I left. I forced myself to move on." James's chest tightened with anger and regret. He couldn't believe this. All this time, he had thought Emily had forgotten about him, when in reality, his own mother had pushed her away. "I didn't know," he said, his voice full of pain. "Emily, I swear I never got your letters. If I had—" "But you didn't," she whispered. "And now it doesn't matter anymore." James shook his head. "It does matter. Everything could have been different." Emily blinked back tears and looked at her son. "But this is my life now. My son is all that matters." James looked at the boy, his heart pounding as a thought crossed his mind. "Emily," he said slowly, his voice careful, "who is his father?" Emily's breath hitched. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she answered, "You." James felt the air leave his lungs. His whole world tilted as he stared at Emily in shock. "What? What did you just say?" His voice was barely above a whisper, but his heart was pounding loudly in his chest. Emily lowered her eyes, her hands trembling as she held onto her son. "He's your son, James," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "I found out I was pregnant not long after you left. I wanted to tell you, but you were already gone." James's mind raced. He looked at the boy, really looked at him. The small, peaceful face, the familiar brown hair, the same shade of eyes he saw in the mirror every morning. How had he not noticed before? His throat felt dry. "Why? Why didn't you tell me?" Emily let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "I tried, James. I told you. I wrote to you. I went to see you. But your mother made it clear that you had moved on, that you didn't want anything to do with me." She swallowed hard. "And when I realized you weren't coming back, I decided I had to do it on my own." James's chest ached. The thought of Emily going through pregnancy alone, raising their son with no support, struggling to survive, it made his heart break. He had been robbed of 6 years of his son's life, 6 years he could never get back. "I didn't know," he said again, his voice thick with emotion. "I swear to you, Emily, I didn't know." She looked at him, her eyes filled with pain. "And if you had," she asked quietly, "would you have come back? Would you have chosen me and our child over the future your mother wanted for you?" James didn't even hesitate. "Yes." His voice was firm, filled with certainty. "I would have." Emily studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether or not to believe him. She had spent years convincing herself that James was gone forever, that he had abandoned her. Now, hearing his words, seeing the raw emotion in his eyes, she felt something inside her waver. But it didn't change the past. "I don't know what you want me to say, James," she murmured. "I spent years fighting to survive. I can't just forget all of that." James took a deep breath, his hands shaking as he ran them through his hair. He had missed so much. He hadn't been there for his son's first steps, his first words, his first day of school, and all because of a lie. But he refused to lose them again. "I don't expect you to forget," he said softly. "And I know I can't change the past, but I can change the future." Emily looked at him, uncertainty in her eyes. "What do you mean?" James's gaze shifted to the little boy still sleeping peacefully. His son. "I mean, I'm not letting you go this time," James said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "You and our son, you're not alone anymore." Emily's breath caught in her throat as she stared at James. His words echoed in her mind. "You're not alone anymore." For so many years, she had carried her burdens alone, convinced that no one would ever come to help her. She had learned to be strong because she had no choice. But now, James was looking at her with such certainty, such determination, that for the first time in a long while, she felt something stir inside her. Hope. But could she trust it? Could she trust him? She looked down at her son, who was still sleeping peacefully, unaware of the storm of emotions swirling in the room. He had only ever known struggle, yet he never complained. He deserved so much more than the life she had been able to give him. "I don't know, James," she whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't just about us anymore. It's about him." She stroked her son's soft hair gently. "I can't let him get hurt." James' expression softened. "Emily, I understand why you're afraid. I can't take back the years we lost. But I can promise you this. I will do everything I can to be a father to him." He leaned forward slightly, his voice steady. "I don't want to miss another moment of his life." Emily bit her lip, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She had dreamed of this moment before, in her loneliest nights. James finding out the truth and stepping up to be a father. But she had also feared it. What if it was too late? What if things were too broken to fix? James seemed to sense her hesitation. "You don't have to decide anything right now," he said gently. "Just let me be here. Let me help." Emily exhaled slowly. Could she allow herself to believe him? Before she could answer, her son stirred in her arms, blinking sleepily. His small voice broke the silence. "Mama." She smiled down at him. "I'm here, sweetheart." Then, to Emily's surprise, the little boy turned his sleepy gaze toward James. "Who's that?" he asked, rubbing his eyes. Emily hesitated. How could she explain this to him? She had never spoken about his father before. She had never wanted to give him false hope. But before she could answer, James spoke, his voice soft but filled with emotion. "Hey, buddy," he said gently. "My name is James." The boy blinked up at him, curiosity in his innocent eyes. "James," he repeated. James swallowed hard, then glanced at Emily, silently asking for permission. She hesitated for a moment, then gave him a small nod. James turned back to the boy, his heart pounding. "Yes," he said. "And I'm your dad." The room fell silent. The little boy tilted his head, studying James for a long moment. Then, to everyone's surprise, he simply yawned and leaned against Emily again, murmuring, "Okay." Emily let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. She looked at James, who was staring at their son with something close to wonder. Maybe, just maybe, a new chapter was beginning.